Now that I've talked about Operation Wetback in my previous video, I think it's even more important to highlight the causation for things like mass immigration in the United States. Now, for some, it's really a reach to understand that mass immigration in the United States is to be expected under a capitalist society, but realistically, it's the basis of capitalism and it's naturally what was supposed to happen, and especially late stage capitalism. The entire system of capitalism runs on the discrimination of a working class and an operating class. In order for society to reach a point of success under capitalism, it has to be a required practice to exploit its workers, because the cheaper the labor, the higher the profit. And under a capitalistic business model, there is no sense of ownership within labor classes. And this is why capitalism and racism have a huge intersection. Because who better to put in a working class, and especially a working class that benefits from the exploitation of its laborers through terrible working conditions and underpay, than a group of people who are already frowned upon in society and already have a systemic level of oppression: minorities. Minorities who have foundationally built the United States. You can look at the influx of immigrants who built the railroads and transit systems, but also down to the building of the White House. Capitalism thrives off of radicalization. It thrives to create a bigger and bigger class divide between the working class and the owning class. The bigger the divide, the bigger the profit for these high class systems. And with privileged classes not wanting to take low level pay or dangerous working conditions from corporations, that still leaves a major gap in the system for that labor field to be filled. This means that non-white or other non-privileged populations have to fill these gaps in order for the economy to still succeed. And when those populations then rise up and revolt for their own civil liberties, it creates another hole in the system, and thus another level to the caste system in the United States. Corporations will run and try to find anybody to now fill this hole, but specifically minorities now that realistically cannot fight for their civil liberties despite their circumstances. And the perfect target? Immigrants. Immigrants who have no civil liberties, no civil rights, and cannot form unions or otherwise speak up for any working conditions that they're in, meaning that they can be severely underpaid and nobody can bat an eye. This cheap labor, although very unethical, makes for great success in American economy. Just look at Operation Bracero. And because realistically, these illegal immigrants have no say as to the minimum wage, what they can get paid from these corporations, they get their wages lowered and lowered and lowered. And although this kind of directly hurts American citizens by making the job field extremely hard to be able to engage in unless you're willing to work for little to no profit, it benefits the American economy as a whole, because with mass exploitation becomes mass profit, but mass profit for only the upper class, because lower class workers sell their labor and have no ownership of what they're really creating, which means this now new amassing profit from exploitation only goes to 1% of billionaires and CEOs, where this profit does not get trickled down to the rest of the American economy. But this all starts because capitalism makes a baseline of acceptance for exploitation, because American citizens are willing to take shitty jobs for shitty pay because it's just part of the system. But what happens when you find workers that are willing to take an even shittier pay for an even shittier job? Illegal immigration is a gold mine for capitalism, and that's why every time there is a sentiment of mass deportation, there are big warnings from economists. Not only because it would take a lot of taxpayer money to even make these actions possible, but because the American capitalist system relies on exploited labor to even operate at this point. And we don't engage in exploitation on a casual level. It's on a base level. American citizens cannot get food or have agricultural or horticultural systems even provide for their citizens without exploited labor. This means that mass deportation wouldn't just put a big hole in taxpayer pockets, but also would create a huge hole in the system and how we operate when it comes to getting food on the table. Holes American citizens aren't really willing to fill because the position itself would be underpaid and exploited, which they know, which is why they don't apply to those jobs in the first place. And that's why the class division was even established. On top of that, illegal immigrants actually fund a huge amount of the American government. In 2022, immigrant-run households paid about 75.6 billion in total taxes. This is why oppressive attitudes always seem to rise in nations that are suffering economically as well. When hardships are high and profits are low, there needs to be another target of another minority that seems to be more deserving to be put in these lower working conditions in order for the rest of us to be able to profit. We can instead point fingers to these minorities that are seemingly causing problems in our system, even though we directly profit from them, instead of pointing fingers to the system. The system that hoards the wealth of this exploitation and never trickles it down to the rest of the American economy, but specifically to the beneficiary classes that are making the economy operate in the first place. This hoard of wealth that doesn't seem to be funding our public education or our healthcare systems. And it happens time and time again. Pigeonholing of minorities for economic hardships isn't new. Look at the Holocaust, look at Operation Wetback, and the prison pipeline system, which is considered modern-day slavery. With the use of systemic, oppressive, and racist laws, we're able to massively incarcerate masses of minorities and using their labor for cheap, thus exploiting American citizens. A capitalistic America is only a land of opportunity for those that are willing to be exploited or those willing to exploit, and that's how it's always been. And minorities have always historically been a scapegoat to point to the faults of an economic system that isn't working for its citizens. Because realistically, if a corporation is unethically hiring people because of the amount that they're able to exploit them, that's not the worker's fault. That's the system's fault. It's a paradoxical relationship because realistically, we can't operate without this lower working class, but we also frown upon the population as a whole because of our racial biases against them. But realistically, after these minority groups are kicked out, who do you think will fill the hole next? The next class, which is unfortunately you. Because class division isn't as close as it used to be. Like I said, capitalism grows on radicalization, and the lower class is now getting lower and lower. And like I said before, with the wealth gap being so high now, there's nothing really separating a lot of American citizens from homelessness other than a trip to the hospital, a family emergency, or a medical bill. And that's purposeful. Because the closer you are to being of need, the better target you are for labor exploitation in the United States. It's just a matter of which system you fall into. It could be a prison system, a deportation system. It could be a pharmaceutical addiction pipeline. Every single system is connected so that exploitation is at the top beneficiary of all of the American economy. And perpetuating violence and bigotry, and especially bigotry through laws in a lower class, only means that you're really just shifting the target closer and closer to yourself. Because, like I said before, that's the ultimate goal of fascism, to convince you that you could never be next. It gives you a source of pride and patriotism to know that you're in a class that could never be touched, that you're somehow higher in a class lower than you, that if you shake hands with the system and you follow all the policies that you will somehow get rewarded. But the system will never care, because at the end of the day, the system will always need operators. Unless you're the one that owns the machine, you are the one that ultimately is going to end up operating it.